In 1941, the Bell P-39 Airacobra arrived in Great Britain with high hopes and a sleek profile. The Royal Air Force, desperate for modern fighters to fend off the Luftwaffe, took delivery of their first squadron. They were looking for something to supplement the Spitfire. They took the P-39 up for combat trials. They landed, climbed out, and essentially said, "Take it back." To the British, and later the American, pilots fighting in the West, the P-39 was a disaster. The war in the West was fought at high altitude. German bombers flew at 20,000 feet. Fighter escorts flew at 30,000 feet. Up there, the air is thin. To fly fast, an engine needs a turbo-supercharger to force air into the cylinders. The P-39 didn't have one. The designers had removed the turbocharger to save space and streamline the aerodynamics. The result was a plane that gasped for breath above 15,000 feet. It was sluggish. It couldn't climb. A German Bf-109 could sit above it, dive, kill it, and zoom back up before the P-39 pilot could even raise the nose. The RAF pilots called it useless. They rejected it after one brief, disastrous operational deployment. The U.S. Army Air Forces weren't much happier. They called it the Flying Dog. They relegated it to training units or sent it to secondary theaters like the South Pacific, where it struggled against the lightweight Japanese Zeros. German intelligence, reading the reports and seeing the lack of P-39s over Europe, dismissed the aircraft. They categorized it as a failed design. A low-tech, heavy American mistake. The German aces, flying their high-performance Messerschmitts, laughed at the idea of fighting such a handicapped opponent. They believed that if they ever saw a P-39, it would be an easy kill. They didn't realize that the P-39 wasn't a bad plane, it was just in the wrong war. And it was about to be shipped to a place where the war was very, very different. The P-39 Airacobra was one of the most unconventional fighters ever built. It was designed by Bell Aircraft, a company known for radical innovation. The designers built the plane around a gun. They wanted to carry the Oldsmobile T9 37mm cannon. This was a massive weapon, originally designed for anti-tank use. It fired a high-explosive shell that could destroy a bomber with one hit. But the gun was huge. It couldn't fit in the wings. It couldn't fit on top of the engine. So, the designers moved the engine. They placed the Allison VE-1710 liquid-cooled engine in the middle of the fuselage, behind the pilot. It was the same layout as a modern Ferrari or Lamborghini. A 10-foot driveshaft ran from the engine, between the pilot's legs, to a reduction gearbox in the nose that spun the propeller. The 37mm cannon fired through the hollow hub of the propeller. This layout gave the P-39 strange characteristics. It had a car door on the side for entry, rather than a sliding canopy. Pilots could roll down the window. It had tricycle landing gear, a nose wheel, which gave the pilot excellent visibility on the ground, a rarity in 1940. But the mid-engine placement also made the center of gravity tricky. If the plane was loaded incorrectly, or if the ammunition was expended, it could become unstable. If a pilot entered a flat spin, the P-39 had a terrifying reputation for being unrecoverable. It would tumble end over end like a leaf. To the Western pilots, these quirks were flaws. The driveshaft vibrated. The car door was hard to bail out of in an emergency, though it could be jettisoned. It seemed like an over-engineered toy. But the Soviet engineers who received the first Lend-Lease shipments looked at the design differently. They saw the nose wheel and realized it was perfect for rough, muddy Russian airfields where a taildragger would nose over. They saw the mid-engine and realized it protected the pilot from attacks from the rear. And they saw the 37mm cannon. They didn't care about the drive shaft. They cared about the gun. To the Soviets, a plane that carried a flying artillery piece wasn't a toy. It was a potential game changer. In 1942, the Soviet Union was bleeding to death. The German Wehrmacht was pushing toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The Red Air Force had been decimated in the opening days of Barbarossa. They needed planes. Any planes. The United States and Britain began the Arctic convoys. Merchant ships, loaded with tanks and aircraft, sailed from Scotland and Iceland, around the top of Norway, to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. It was the most dangerous shipping route in the world. German U-boats, battleships, and bombers based in Norway attacked the convoys relentlessly. Thousands of sailors died in the freezing waters. But the ships got through. And in their holds were thousands of crates containing disassembled P-39s. The British didn't want them. The Americans were replacing them with P-38s and P-47s. So they sent the rejects to Russia. When the crates were unloaded on the icy docks of Murmansk, the Soviet mechanics went to work. They assembled the planes in sub-zero temperatures. They painted red stars over the white American stars. The Soviet pilots who arrived to collect them were initially suspicious. They had heard the rumors. The Iron Dog. But they were flying obsolete I-16s or Lend-Lease Hurricanes that were too slow to catch the Germans. The P-39 was shiny. It had a radio. It had a heater, a luxury. And it had that massive cannon. The first test flights were tentative. The Soviet pilots discovered the spin issues. They learned that the plane was unforgiving if handled roughly. But they also discovered something else. At low altitude, the P-39 was fast. Very fast. And in the Soviet Union, nobody flew high. The Germans, watching the convoys arrive, knew the Americans were sending aid. But they weren't worried about the P-39. Their aces, like Erich Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn, were racking up hundreds of kills against Soviet Yaks and large EGs. They thought the P-39 would just be another target. They didn't realize that the reject had just landed in the only environment on Earth where it could thrive. The air war on the Eastern Front was unique. In the West, thousands of bombers flew at 25,000 feet to destroy cities. Fighters had to go up there to stop them. In the East, the air war was tactical. It was about supporting the tanks and the infantry. The targets were on the ground. Tanks, trucks, artillery batteries. Therefore, the planes flew low. Most combat on the Eastern Front took place below 10,000 feet, often below 5,000 feet. This was the oxygen mask line. Above it, you needed oxygen and superchargers. Below it, the air was thick and rich. In this environment, the P-39's lack of a turbocharger was irrelevant. The Allison VER 1710 engine was optimized for low altitude. Down on the deck, it produced tremendous torque and horsepower. At 5,000 feet, the P-39 was faster than the German Bf-109 and capable of matching the FW-190. It could outdive almost anything. The Soviet pilots realized they had a hot rod. The aerodynamics of the P-39 were sleek. It had low drag. While the German engines were straining to pull their planes through thin air at high altitude, the P-39 was eating up the thick air at treetop level. The Western reject had found its niche. It wasn't a high-altitude interceptor. It was a frontline brawler. The Germans continued to fly their high-altitude tactics, expecting the Soviets to be sluggish. But when they dove down to attack Soviet Sturmovix or tanks, they found themselves in the P-39's playground. Suddenly, the Iron Dog wasn't sluggish. It was turning inside them. It was catching them in dives. The German pilots, who had smirked at the strange American plane with the car doors, began to feel a new sensation. Confusion. Why was this bad plane performing so well? They were about to learn that in the mud and snow of Russia, you don't need a high-altitude flyer. You need a street fighter. And the P-39 was the toughest street fighter in the neighborhood. The Soviet pilots called the P-39's cannon the Big Stick. The 37mm Oldsmobile T9 was a beast. It didn't fire a solid bullet, it fired a high-explosive artillery shell. A single hit from this weapon was almost guaranteed to destroy a fighter plane. 2 or 3 hits would tear the wing off a German bomber like the Heinkel He-111 or Junkers Ju-88. But the gun had flaws. It had a slow rate of fire, about 2.5 rounds per second. It held only 30 rounds of ammunition in a large drum magazine. The trajectory of the heavy shell was different from the machine guns, making aiming difficult at long range. American pilots often fired all their guns at once, a spray and pray method. The result was often missing with the cannon while hitting with the machine guns. The Soviet pilots developed a different technique. They were snipers. They would use the machine guns to range the target. Once they saw the machine gun bullets hitting, they knew they were in range. Then, they would fire the cannon. Crucially, they would close to very short range, sometimes as close as 50 meters, before firing the 37mm. At this range, the slow rate of fire didn't matter. The drop of the shell didn't matter. You couldn't miss. A single press of the trigger. Thump. The German pilots found this terrifying. They would be flying along, thinking they were safe from the light machine guns. Then a P-39 would suddenly close in, and their world would explode. Soviet aces were known to return from a mission having shot down 2 or 3 German planes, having used only 3 or 4 cannon shells. They treated the P-39 not as a machine gun platform, but as a flying sniper rifle. The German bombers, which could absorb hundreds of machine gun bullets, were helpless against the high explosive punch of the 37mm. The P-39 became the premier bomber killer of the Red Air Force. The German crews, who had smirked at the slow-firing American gun, realized that it only needed to hit once. If there is one man responsible for turning the P-39 from a reject into a legend, it is Alexander Pokryshkin. Pokryshkin was a brilliant tactician and the second highest-scoring Allied ace of the war, with 59 kills, most in the P-39. He was a maverick. He openly criticized Soviet tactics, which in 1942 were rigid and defensive. Soviet pilots flew in tight, inflexible formations and were ordered to protect ground troops at all costs, often leading to them being bounced by German hunters. Pokryshkin studied the P-39. He saw its strengths and its weaknesses. He developed a new tactical doctrine, famously summarized on a chalkboard as altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. He realized that the P-39's speed at low altitude was its greatest asset. He pioneered the vertical fight in the Red Air Force. Instead of turning horizontally with the agile German Bf-109s, he taught his pilots to use the P-39's momentum to zoom upwards, then dive back down for an attack. He introduced the Cuban ladder or stack formation. Soviet fighters would fly in pairs, stacked at different altitudes like steps on a ladder. The lowest pair would be the bait. The Germans would dive on them. But as the Germans attacked, the higher pairs of P-39s would dive on the Germans. It was a layered trap. The Germans, used to finding Soviet fighters flying in a single, vulnerable layer, suddenly found themselves being attacked from above by planes they didn't even know were there. Pokryshkin was also a fanatic about radio discipline and initiative. He gave his pilots the freedom to hunt. Find the enemy and attack him, he ordered. He personally led his Guards regiment from the front, his P-39 painted with a distinct white nose. Under his leadership, the P-39 units became the elite of the Red Air Force. The German aces soon learned to identify Pokryshkin's unit. The radio call Achtung! Pokryshkin became a signal to clear the skies. They weren't smirking anymore. They were running. The mid-engine layout of the P-39, so hated by Western pilots, gave it a unique characteristic that Soviet pilots learned to exploit. The center of gravity was located right in the middle of the plane. This made the P-39 incredibly nimble around its vertical axis. It could tumble. If a German fighter got on a P-39's tail, the Soviet pilot could perform a violent maneuver. He would pull the stick back hard and kick the rudder. The P-39 would snap into a tight tumble, almost reversing its direction mid-air. It was a controlled stall. Most fighters, if you did that, would enter an unrecoverable spin. But the P-39, because the weight was centered, could be snapped out of the tumble by a skilled pilot. The German pilot, flying a nose-heavy Bf-109 or FW-190, couldn't follow this maneuver. If he tried, he would stall and spin out of control. He would shoot past the P-39. Suddenly, the roles were reversed. The P-39 recovered from the tumble and was now behind the German. Soviet pilots called this the Cobra maneuver, long before the modern Su-27 maneuver of the same name. It was a high-risk tactic that required perfect timing and knowledge of the aircraft's limits. But it allowed the P-39 to escape impossible situations. The Germans found this baffling. They were used to Soviet pilots trying to turn horizontally. Now, they were facing a plane that seemed to defy aerodynamics. It could hang on its propeller in a climb, tumble in a dive, and snap roll faster than anything else in the sky. The unstable plane became the ultimate dogfighting weapon in the hands of pilots who weren't afraid to push it to the edge of control. The German pilots began to report that the P-39 was uncanny in a close fight. The smirk had been replaced by a healthy respect for a machine that could turn the tables in the blink of an eye. The Soviets were not content to fly the P-39 as it was delivered. They were hot rodders. They constantly modified the aircraft to squeeze out more performance. The standard P-39Q, the most common version in Russia, came with the 37mm cannon, 2.50 caliber machine guns in the nose, and 4.30 caliber machine guns in wing pods. This was a lot of firepower, but the wing guns added weight and drag. The Soviet aces and their mechanics decided they didn't need the small guns. In the field workshops of frontline airfields, they stripped the wing guns out. They removed the guns, the ammunition, the feed chutes, and the mounting hardware. They faired over the holes in the wings to make them smooth. This reduced the weight of the plane by several hundred pounds. The result was a P-39 that was faster, climbed better, and rolled quicker. It was now armed with just the cannon and the two nose-mounted .50 calibers. This was still plenty of firepower to kill anything flying. By concentrating all the firepower in the nose, it also solved the problem of gun harmonization, making wing guns converge at a specific distance. The nose guns always fired straight. This modification was so successful that Bell eventually began producing a version without wing guns specifically for the Soviet contract. The Germans were facing hot-rodded Airacobras. They would engage a P-39, expecting it to have a certain performance, only to find that this particular plane was faster and more agile than the manual said. The Soviet pilots were constantly looking for an edge. They polished the surfaces of their planes to reduce drag. They tuned their engines for maximum power. They took the Iron Dog and turned it into a thoroughbred. They proved that even a flawed design could be made into a world-beater if you were willing to take a wrench to it and throw away the parts you didn't need. Spring 1943. The Cuban bridgehead. This was the Stalingrad of the air war. Over a small patch of land near the Black Sea, the Luftwaffe and the Red Air Force threw everything they had at each other in a struggle for air superiority. For the first time, the Soviets were not fighting on the back foot. They were fighting to win. And leading the charge were the P-39 regiments. Alexander Pokryshkin's 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment was at the center of the storm. The air battles were massive. Sometimes up to 100 aircraft were engaged in a single furball. The Germans sent wave after wave of Ju-87 Stukas and Heinkel 111s to bomb the Soviet bridgehead, escorted by their best Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters. The P-39s were waiting. Using the new stack tactics, the P-39s dominated the vertical space. The Germans would dive on the lower Soviet fighters, often Yaks or large EGs, only to find P-39s diving on them from higher altitude. The combat was brutal and close range. The P-39's nose-mounted guns were devastating in the head-on passes that defined the Cuban battle. When a P-39 and a Bf-109 flew at each other, the P-39 pilot had the advantage of a massive cannon firing straight down the center line. He didn't have to worry about wing convergence. German bombers fell by the dozens. The 37mm shells tore them apart. Soviet pilots reported seeing Heinkel bombers literally dissolve in mid-air after taking a hit from a Cobra. The Battle of the Cuban lasted for 2 months. By the end, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,100 aircraft. It was the turning point. The Germans lost air superiority over the Eastern Front, and they never regained it. The P-39 Airacobra had proven that it could go toe-to-toe with the best the Luftwaffe had and win. The smirking German aces found themselves fighting for their lives against a plane they had dismissed as a failure. They realized too late that the Iron Dog had a bite that could snap the spine of the Luftwaffe. As the war progressed, the silhouette of the P-39 became a source of dread for German pilots. They learned to recognize it instantly. The long nose. The air intake behind the canopy. The car-style doors. It looked like a snake ready to strike. German radio traffic monitors began to pick up a frantic warning, Achtung! Cobra. This warning carried a specific weight. It meant that the enemy was not flying wooden yaks or undergunned Hurricanes. It meant they were flying the American cannon birds. And it usually meant they were facing the Guards regiments, the Aces. The psychological impact was profound. German bomber crews knew that their armor plating could stop machine gun bullets. But they knew it couldn't stop a 37mm exploding shell. When they saw Cobras approaching, German formations would often scatter, dropping their bombs early to gain speed and escape. They broke formation discipline. And once a bomber formation breaks, it dies. The P-39 pilots exploited this fear. They painted their planes with bright colors, slogans, and kill stars. They wanted the Germans to know who they were. They flew aggressively, confident that their machines could take punishment and dish it out. The P-39 was rugged. Its rear engine layout protected the pilot from head-on fire. The engine block acted as a shield. The heavy drive shaft running through the cockpit acted as a keel, keeping the fuselage intact during crash landings. German pilots who managed to shoot down a P-39 often watched in frustration as the Soviet pilot climbed out of the wreck, dusted himself off, and walked away. The legend of the UN-killable Cobra grew. The Germans had started the war laughing at the American reject. They ended the war warning each other to run away from it. There is a persistent myth in history that the P-39 was a tank buster on the Eastern Front. It makes sense. It had a big anti-tank gun in the nose. But the reality was more subtle. The United States supplied the Soviet Union primarily with high-explosive He shells for the 37mm cannon, not armor-piercing AP shells. The He shells were devastating against aircraft and soft targets, trucks, infantry, but they would bounce off the thick armor of a Tiger or Panther tank. So, while P-39s did strafe German columns and destroy thousands of trucks, their primary role wasn't killing tanks. Their role was protecting the tank killers. The real Soviet tank buster was the Ilyushin Illinois II Sturmovik. That flying tank. The Illinois II was slow and heavy. It was vulnerable to German fighters. The P-39 became the shepherd of the Sturmoviks. The Airacobras would fly in top cover for the Illinois IIs. They would loiter above the battlefield, watching for German Bf-109s trying to dive on the Sturmoviks. When the Germans attacked, the P-39s would intercept them. The P-39 was perfect for this. Its low-altitude speed and agility allowed it to tangle with the German fighters right down on the deck. They kept the German fighters off the backs of the Illinois IIs, allowing the Sturmoviks to destroy the panzer divisions. So, while the P-39 didn't usually blow up the tanks itself, it made the destruction of the tanks possible. It was a symbiotic relationship. The Illinois II was the hammer. The P-39 was the shield. Together, they ground the Wehrmacht into the mud. German panzer crews learned to look up. If they saw P-39s, they knew the Sturmovix were coming. And they knew there was no Luftwaffe air cover coming to save them, because the Cobras had already chased them away. May 1945. Berlin. The war was over. On the captured German airfields around the capital, the Soviet fighter regiments lined up their aircraft. Among the Yaks and the La-7 sat the P-39 Airacobras. They were battered. Their paint was faded. They were covered in soot and oil. But on their noses were rows and rows of red stars. The statistics are staggering. Of the top 5 highest-scoring Soviet aces of World War II, 3 of them flew the P-39. Grigory Rechkalov, 56 kills, 50 in the P-39. Alexander Pokryshkin, 59 kills, 48 in the P-39. Nikolai Gulev, 57 kills, many in the P-39. The P-39 destroyed more German aircraft than any other US-produced fighter type on the Eastern Front. It wasn't the Mustang. It wasn't the Thunderbolt. It was the Reject. The plane that the British hated and the Americans ignored became the sword of the Soviet Union. Why? Because it was the right tool for the right job. The Germans had judged the plane based on high-altitude performance, which didn't matter in Russia. The Soviets judged it based on low-altitude lethality, which mattered everything. The Soviet pilots loved the P-39. They called it steel-breasted because of its durability. They resisted transitioning to newer Soviet fighters late in the war. They wanted to keep their Cobras. Pokryshkin famously refused to fly the Soviet La-7, insisting on keeping his P-39 until the very end of the war. As the pilots toasted their victory with vodka on the wings of their American planes, they knew the truth. The Iron Dog wasn't a dog. It was a wolf. And it had eaten the Luftwaffe. The smirks of the German aces in 1941 had turned into the silence of the grave in 1945. And the P-39 Airacobra, the unwanted orphan of the West, stood triumphant in the ruins of the Third Reich.